so determined to deal with the crisis the NHS is facing and to make sure it is ready for the modern challenges we face. At the heart of our vision for the country are stronger public services and stronger economic growth. We know that getting public services back on track will support a growing economy, and that a growing economy in turn will support modern, sustainable public services. And we know that before us today, we have a choice to end the unfair 200-year-old tax loophole that lets a small number of people avoid tax on overseas income and use the money saved to fund one of the biggest workforce expansion plans in the history of the NHS. That is the choice in front of us today, and I will urge all MPs to do the right thing by backing our plan.
I have to notify the House, in accordance with the Royal Assent Act 1967, that His Majesty has signified his royal assent to the following acts: Identity and Language Northern Ireland Act 2022, Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act 2022, Councillors of State Act 2022, Northern Ireland Executive Formation etc. Act 2022. I now call Minister Victoria Atkins.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a genuine pleasure to close this debate on behalf of the Government, and I would like to start by placing on record my thanks to the extraordinary staff of the National Health Service, on whom this country relies day in and day out. As the Chancellor told this House less than 3 weeks ago, the service we depend on more than any other is the NHS. Indeed, the NHS is one of the reasons I took the decision to put myself forward for public office, because at the age of 3, the National Health Service diagnosed type 1 diabetes, and I have been genuinely moved and supported by the NHS ever since then. It is thanks to them that I'm standing at this dispatch box. Maintaining this service relies above all on the foundations of a strong economy, which was exactly the purpose of the autumn statement. We acknowledge that there are specific issues which need tackling, and the Chancellor, himself a former Health Secretary, was frank in seeking to address them. Members may recall that we debated the pressures facing the economy. The number one issue facing the economy at the moment is inflation. It is precisely because inflation is at a generational high that the prices of everything our constituents buy and rely on has gone up, including, of course, food and heating. That hurts everyone, but it hurts the poorest the most, which is why in the autumn statement we had laid out a plan to tackle inflation, to grow the economy and to protect public services. One of the most effective measures, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, was the introduction of the energy price guarantee, coupled with payments for the most vulnerable in society. Again, should any colleagues need help with their constituents, please look at the government website, helpforhouseholds.gov.uk, where you can help direct constituents to help. But the OBR said that our plan has helped to dull inflation by a couple of points. It has helped to protect 70,000 jobs, and it has ensured that this recession is shallower than it would otherwise have been. And there was some discussion during the debate about growth. I gently remind the House that we had the third highest rate of growth in the G7 from 2010 to 2022. I turn then to the important subject of the NHS workforce. And the Honourable Lady for Wirral West rightly acknowledged that this extraordinary organisation has just been through the worst public health crisis we have ever seen. I think she put it extremely well. And I hope we are all we're able to discuss this in a way that is measured and does not need to fall into ideological argument when we acknowledge the impact that that extraordinary event has had on our workforces. The members across the House, for example, reference the exhaustion that NHS staff feel and the impact that that has had on waiting lists. I give way.
Could acknowledge, I also pointed out that the crisis predates the pandemic as well. I'd be grateful if she could acknowledge that too.
She perhaps misunderstood me. I was saying I was trying to be collegiate and referencing what she had said about COVID itself. We do know that, of course, there have been pressures on the workforce, on the NHS, throughout its decades of history, and every generation has the new challenge, I think, of ensuring that the NHS meets the hopes, the needs, the expectations of our constituents. But my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, in opening this debate, set out our plans for the NHS and explained that we are taking specific steps on issues such as workforce shortages, where we will have an independently verified plan for the number of doctors, nurses and other professionals we will need in 5, 10 and 15 years' time, taking full account of the need for better retention and productivity improvements. And that will build on what are already some significant statistics. Between September 2019 and August 2022, the NHS has more than 14,000 more hospital doctors and 29,000 more nurses and health visitors. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Minister, I thank the Minister for giving way, and she spoke a few moments ago of the importance of approaching the issue of the NHS in measured tones. Therefore, I think it's a really important opportunity. Can she take this opportunity to say that it was wrong for her ministerial colleague to attempt on the media to associate our NHS staff with Vladimir Putin and his horrific invasion of Ukraine? I think it's really important to right the wrong by correcting that, please.
So, I haven't seen it myself, but from descriptions I've heard, I'm not quite sure that was what he was trying to... the honourable ladies asked me why I haven't watched it. I was actually at a birthday party with my 10-year-old, forgive me, or getting ready for a birthday party for my 10-year-old. We are allowed lives outside this place. But between, for those who have commented on workforce figures over the last decade, between May 2010 and August 2022, 36,000 more hospital doctors and 38,000 more nurses and health visitors were recruited. And we are also asking the NHS, like all public services, to tackle productivity and inefficiency. My honourable friend for Peterborough emphasised the importance of this and brought his experience into this debate. The initial findings, to help colleagues, by Patricia Hewitt, the former Labour Health Secretary, will be delivered to the department within 3 weeks, which shows the pace of work that Ms Hewitt and others are taking on this really important project. In addition, we are boosting NHS funding by £3.3 billion next year and by another £3.3 billion the year after that, helping to ensure that the NHS can take rapid action to improve urgent and emergency care and to get elective performance back to pre-pandemic levels. I'm just going to make, if I may, a little progress. Amanda Pritchard, the Chief Executive of the NHS, has said this should provide sufficient funding for the NHS to fulfil its key priorities and shows the government is serious about its commitment to prioritise the NHS. But both the Honourable Lady for Coventry North West and indeed my Honourable friend for Peterborough emphasised the role, for example, that pharmacies can play. And I would hope that we can discuss ways in which different services can be delivered differently over the NHS in the coming months and years. And of course, my Honourable friend, the Select Committee Chairman, made the very, very sound point that prevention is part of productivity. Overall, the NHS resource budget in England is expected to increase to £165.9 billion in 2024 to 25, up from £123.7 billion in 2019 to 20. Our determination to deal with the COVID backlogs has seen the NHS already hit its first milestone in terms of waits of over 2 years, and it will go further, eliminating waits of over 18 months by April next year, over 15 months by March 2024, and over a year by March 2025. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, compared this with the figures in Wales, Labour-run Wales, and noted that a fifth of the population there is waiting for care, and remarked on the curious anomaly that Wales stopped publishing its vacancy rates in terms of workforce in 2011. I will, and I must make progress, but I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
For giving way. The Minister talks about those waiting lists dropping. I'd really like, I'd like to hear from the Minister an explanation as to how in one 24-hour period last week, in the whole of the UK, there was one paediatric intensive care unit bed. What's the explanation for that, Minister?
There's a very serious point he raises. I don't have the answer to hand, but I will ensure that the relevant health minister writes to him, because I do understand why he raises it. There has, of course, been a great deal of discussion about nurses' pay, and we are extremely regretful and very much are hoping that accommodations and agreements can be found. Just again to put into context recent pay rises, more than 1 million staff, including nurses, have benefited from a pay rise of at least £1,400 backdated to April this year, and this is on top of the 3% pay rise they received last year. My right honourable friend for the Health Select Committee did ask the question, and it's an interesting one: does Labour support or oppose the independent pay review bodies, because these are the ones that set these recommendations and which have been accepted? I'm going to move now to, I'm not going to because I've got to finish. I'm going to move now to non-DOMs, and I must congratulate the Shadow Minister on his florid use of language in relation to my advocacy efforts in the finance bill. I hope that I was able to answer his question, which I will do in a moment. The motion deals with non-DOM taxpayers. As I have said repeatedly, and I hope at some point it will get through, non-DOM residents who live in the UK have to pay UK taxes on their UK income and gains just like anyone else. It raised £7.9 billion last year, and they have invested £6 billion in investment. The area over which there is disagreement is the rules in relation to foreign income. They ask if this is the answer. I've watched with great interest how the sum that they have put in their motion apparently is going to answer all sorts of economic difficulties, particularly during the finance bill as well. I'm not sure it will quite add up, but interestingly, it was a Conservative government who reformed non-DOM laws to end the ability to claim this status permanently. Again, I just note that the non-DOM status seemed to survive during 13 years of Labour government. But in any event, the Chancellor said very frankly, the Chancellor said very frankly in the Health Select Committee, in the Treasury Select Committee evidence he gave last week, that he has asked officials to look at it. We have the workforce strategy which will be delivered. NHS England has done considerable work, and we hope that it will report as soon as possible. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been a real pleasure for me to be able to praise the NHS and thank its extraordinary staff. What the NHS needs is a government making the right decisions for the economy so that we can actually afford a world-class health service. That is what this government is determined to deliver.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye!
The contrary, no.
No!
Division, no lobby.
Division!
Question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. Tellers for the ayes, Colleen Fletcher and Gerald Jones. Tellers for the noes, Lillian Greenwood and Mark Tarmy. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 226. The noes to the left, 0.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 226. The noes to the left, 0. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it unlocked. Thank you. Point of order, Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Once again today, we have had an Opposition Day debate in which the government has refused to vote in this debate. We've had an incredibly important motion in front of the House on a matter that's of significant importance and interest to my constituents. Now, in the first 7 years I was in Parliament, we always had votes on Opposition Days, and this is one of the ways that the government are undermining the House of Commons and refusing to listen. We have got a specific request passed by this House in this motion, which the government will then just go on, as they have done before, and ignored. Can I ask you, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether there's been any discussion by Mr Speaker about reasserting the position of this House? It was never the case in the past that the government ignored Opposition Days. In fact, in the Blair government, they changed the policy on Gurkhas as a result of an Opposition Day debate that the government has lost. Has there been any discussion about reasserting the voice of Parliament so that when the House passes a motion, the government listens to that motion?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order. First of all, I'm sure he is well aware that such a motion that we've just passed would not be binding. It was the case, I know, as he says, that governments might participate a little more in the votes than they have recently. And it was the case some time ago that the government agreed to give a response to motions that have been passed. It is up to individual members and to the government to decide whether they wish to participate in votes. It is not the job of the Speaker to compel them. I'm sure he appreciates that as well. I'm not aware of any current discussions with the current leader of the House, but this is something that perhaps the honourable gentleman could raise in business questions if he wished to. And I'm sure the Treasury bench will have heard the comment that he has made. Thank you. We now come to the second Opposition Day motion on government PPE contracts. Before we begin this debate, I would like to remind members that this motion gives general reasons why the House might agree to the humble address. The normal rule that reflections must not be cast upon members of either House of Parliament, except on a substantive motion, remains in force. And I'm sure that honourable and right honourable members will ensure that that rule is stuck to in their speeches. I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Angela Rayner, to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The motion before the House is very simple. This is a plea for answers, a plea for clarity and a plea for the truth. And the choice that the House makes today is simple too. Our demand is clear. End the cover-up and begin the clean-up. We already know that the so-called VIP lane for PPE enabled the shameful waste of taxpayers' money and inexcusable profiteering by unfit and unqualified providers. We know that the government has already written off £10 billion of public funds spent on their personal protective equipment that was either unusable, overpriced or undelivered. Ministers have admitted that they are still paying £770,000 a day of taxpayers' cash to store gloves, goggles and gowns, enough to pay for 75,000 spaces in after-school clubs or 19,000 in full-time nursery care. £106,000 of that money is sent to China every day alone to pay for the storage costs. We already know that £4 billion worth of unusable PPE has been burnt to generate power after 70 million PPE items were sold off for just £400,000. What we don't yet know, Madam Deputy Speaker, is what was said in correspondence between the key participants of the benches opposite and the unqualified cronies on the make and on the take. We don't even know exactly where our money ended up. But we do know that if ministers get their way, this system could be used again, and this scandal repeated, enriching fraudsters at the expense of the taxpayer and creating a new mountain of waste.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. She's absolutely right that there is a scandalous waste of public money here. But equally important is that we know that our care sector and health sector was desperate for PPE during the pandemic. Specialised Canvas in my constituency actually changed all of their manufacturing to be able to make PPE and got a large number of contracts from individual trusts, but they were completely unable to get any contracts out of the Department of Health. So alongside the public money wastage, there was also the fact that we had nurses and carers unable to access PPE when they desperately needed it at the height of the pandemic.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. There's 2 points that are made there, which I will come on to in my speech in greater detail. But one was the lack of PPE for those on the front line, and also the total disrespect in the way in which these contracts through the VIP lane was handed out at the expense of businesses up and down the UK who had experience, who could have helped during the pandemic, who were not party to WhatsApps or whatever else that got them to ministers access to the VIP lane. Take the mystery of a PPE company with links to a Tory politician. While it is for the authorities to decide whether any law is broken, and I won't be commenting on the ongoing investigations, we do know that PPE MedPro was referred to the VIP lane by a sitting member of the Cabinet after lobbying from another Tory politician 5 days before it was even legally registered as a company. The House may recall that this particular company was subsequently awarded 2 contracts worth £203 billion to supply PPE, £81 million to supply 210 million face masks was awarded on May 2020. And a £122 million contract to supply 25 million surgical gowns was awarded in June 2020. Madam Deputy Speaker, the face masks bought by this government from MedPro for more than twice the price as identical items from other suppliers. And the surgical gowns rejected for use in the NHS after a technical inspection. All of them never even used. It points to a total failure of due diligence and the rotten stench of cronyism.
I thank my right honourable friends for giving way. During the early months of the pandemic, I was being contacted by PPE suppliers known to the NHS, long-term suppliers, who told me that they were being rejected as they were offering help. One of them wrote to me and he said, pre-April 2020, there was a degree of total incompetence about the government handling of PPE purchases. However, by the way they scrutinised our own offers thereafter, we believe they knew, at least specification-wise, exactly what they were doing and that senior managers were taking steps to use preferred suppliers, even though they were aware these suppliers had neither the track record nor the level of competence to produce compliant goods. What does my right honourable friend think about that?
I think it absolutely stinks, and I think actually my honourable friend is absolutely right in that the public can see through this and those businesses that are pretty angry because they wanted to do the right thing during the pandemic. They knew it was a situation that Britain faced that they'd not faced before as a global pandemic, and they wanted to do their bit. And the frustration and my right honourable friend who's right to quote her business, is that there is no question that the specifications should have been known, and therefore why was all this PPE bought knowing full well it couldn't be used? I'll give way, thank you.
I'm very grateful to my old friend for giving away. Does she agree with me that the mood in her constituents, as in mine, opposite these dealings, is one of faith being completely shaken in the good governance and process of this nation, and that people at the very least are saying that the monies that have been obtained and goods not properly utilised has to be returned, and if the circumstances so dictate, there should be criminal prosecutions long before an inquiry can progress.
I think my honourable friend is right to capture the mood of the public on this, because at a time where the public are told that we have to show restraint, at a time where the public can see the finances, not least because of this government's former Prime Minister and Chancellor and the crashing of the economy, but it absolutely galls them to think that ministers opposite were not doing the due diligence that was required with the funds that we needed, and now we have this situation where we are spending billions of pounds on wasted PPE, and we've also got thousands of pounds every single day that is being wasted on storage for PPE. I'll happily give way.
But obviously, in government, you have to actually get on and make decisions, and we don't often get to see what the Labour Party would do in our place. On this occasion, we did have an insight because, of course, the Labour Party did recommend a whole series of people that could supply vital things during the pandemic, vital supplies, including a football agent supplying ventilators. What assessment have you made of the quality and credibility has the chair made of the Labour Party's own suggestions for supplies during the pandemic?
I will in a sec. I thank the honourable member for his comments, but I asked the honourable member how many members from across the House that were not Conservative members got VIP access to the VIP lanes. I can give the honourable member the answer: none, zilch, zero. And this is the problem, because the due diligence wasn't done on those contracts, and it was his government's problem, his government's responsibility and his government's failure. I'll happily give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and she's making an excellent speech. Would she agree with me that there's a huge contrast between the comments of the National Audit Office on the way that the Welsh Government procured PPE, where they were not wasting public money, where they're getting value for money, and they were not ending up having to explain to the House how they gave contracts to various people? And would you not agree with me that that is the way that a Labour government in action really works?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and this was a global pandemic, and yet we see it is the UK government that is constantly criticised about these contracts and the way in which they were doled out and given. And all this motion to the House today is asking for is transparency. What have you got to hide? I'll happily give way.
I thank the Shadow Minister, or Shadow Secretary of State, for giving way. She's making a very powerful speech. Today has been a really important day because we've met fire brigades unions from across the country who have come down to stand up for a decent salary. That's all they're asking for. And what this debate illustrates, is that the government can find billions of pounds to hand over in a crisis to well-connected supporters. And if the allegations are true of the member from the other place, enough money from that alleged dividend would have settled the firefighters' settlement in Scotland in totality, one person against every firefighter. Will she confirm that a Labour government, an incoming Labour government, will investigate this matter thoroughly and transparently and hold anyone who has bent the rules, however they have done so will be held to justice.
Angela Rayner.
I thank the honourable member for his point, and he's absolutely right. And the FBU members, Fire Brigade Union members, were in Parliament today and outside, and they are frustrated, like many others who are being told that there isn't money to give them a pay rise, and that actually they're going to get a real terms pay cut. But at the same time, billions of pounds has been wasted. And as I said in my opening remarks, is that £770,000 a day on storing this equipment. It is not acceptable to most people and most members of the public. I'll happily give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend on the front bench giving way. She's highlighted one particular legal situation, but I'm sure she's aware that the Department for Health and Social Care remains in dispute on 176 contracts for PPE worth £2.7 billion. And I wondered if she had any thoughts about that.
My honourable friend, the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, is absolutely right. It is absolutely eye-watering and astonishing that 176 contracts remain in this situation. And the public can see that. The public can see this, and they are frustrated because it is not acceptable. It is not okay to govern in that way, and the public rightly want answers, and they want them now. Now, the links between MedPro company and the Tory peer in question were never publicly disclosed. In fact, they were denied repeatedly by the lawyers acting for those involved. We now know that the money ended up in offshore accounts directly linked to those individuals. By their own admission, this was for so-called tax efficiency. It seems they even dodged paying their own taxes on the profits they made from ours. Only after a long legal battle was it revealed that there was active lobbying from ministerial colleagues for access to the VIP lane, and substantial contracts were won by those companies. They said that the peer in question did not benefit from these contracts, a denial that has been rather undermined by the latest revelations of The Guardian rather than any disclosure of ministers. Because it was only some time after The Guardian exposed these links that a minister finally told me, in answer to a parliamentary question, that, and I quote, "Departmental records reflect that a link between Baroness Mone and PPE MedPro was clear prior to contracts being awarded." But ministers have for months refused to show us those records or tell us the nature of that link and whether it was declared or whether it was discovered in due diligence. This was the subject of an investigation by the Standards Commissioners in the other place, and yet it appears ministers sat on the information they had. So the question is very simple, Madam Deputy Speaker. What have ministers opposite got to hide? Did they know all along who was behind the PPE MedPro? Or was due diligence so poor that they did not realise the problem? If they had nothing to hide and no rules or laws were broken, then ministers will surely be happy to make the details of the meetings and the correspondence available. And while they're at it, will the minister give us clarity about allegations made by the former Health Secretary in his new book about a separate bid for business connected to Baroness Mone? Not Mone.
The Right Honourable Lady is venturing rather too far into the territory that I urged her to avoid. I'm afraid that these are the rules, so I do have to bring her up if she is, to pull her up if she is actively criticising a member of the other place. I'm sorry about that, but that is the rule. Angela Rayner.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I wasn't criticising members from the other place. I'm just quoting what a member from this place, who was a health minister at the time, has said. And I'm asking the minister today if he can give us clarity on what was said, because that's now public record. So that's all I'm asking the Minister for. I haven't said that about any person from the other place. That is what a Minister has said in his diary. So it would be nice if the Minister opposite can give us some light on this whole murky affair. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, let's turn to the numbers, because as they say, the numbers don't lie. 10. How many times a company was more likely to get a contract if it was in the VIP lane? 1 in 5. The proportion of emergency contracts handed out by the government that have been flagged for corruption. 3.5 billion. That's the value in pounds of contracts given to the Tory party's mates that we know of. 3 billion. The value in pounds of contracts awarded that warrant further investigation. None, zilch, 0. That's the number of times this government has come clean on this dodgy MedPro scandal. A cover-up, a whitewash, events swept under the carpet, and now they've been dragged kicking and screaming to the House today to give an honest account about their shameful dealings. The public are sick of being ripped off and being taken for fools, and they want to know the truth. So today, I will give way.
Is it not clear to the public now that the party opposite believe in one thing only, and that is how much money they can grab from the public purse and give to their crony friends and steal from the hard-working pockets of people in this country?
I think my honourable friend captures the mood of the public. They want answers. The public want answers. They want to know what's happened. At the time when they needed this government the most to act responsibly, what's happened to their money and what happened with these contracts. So today we've tabled this motion and we will put it to a vote. Let me be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we're not asking the government to do anything that would undermine any chance of recovering our money or that would conflict with any police investigation. But for 10 months, they have told us that they are in mediation. What progress has been made? When will they conclude it has failed and take action now? Can they actually get our money back? Or are they just kicking the can down the road? So our motion asks ministers to hand over the records to the Public Accounts Committee, a body this House relies on to hold them to account for public spending. Because the only logical conclusion is that they do indeed have something to hide. The public deserve answers on whether the dodgy lobbying at the heart of this scandal played a part in how vast sums of taxpayers' cash has been wasted, and whether shameful profiteering has been enabled by this government. Which leads me to the second simple question for the House today. Will members opposite, well, the few that are in, will members opposite now vote for a clean-up or yet another cover-up? Just last week, the government led Tory members in the other place through the lobbies to block an amendment to their procurement bill. It would have banned VIP lanes in future procurement decisions. But they voted it down. They voted to protect unlawful VIP access instead of protecting taxpayers' money. The Prime Minister is peddling legislation full of loopholes that would give Tory ministers free rein to do it all over again. Fresh for the House is whether to act to prevent a repeat. So today, I say to honourable and right honourable members opposite, learn your lesson. Don't let this shameful episode be repeated. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the loss and trauma of the pandemic was immense. Millions of families lost loved ones, some only getting to say goodbye via iPad as mothers, fathers, husbands, wives and friends slipped away. And then we learn that throughout this trauma, companies with WhatsApp links to ministers were given special VIP access to contracts which have seen billions poured down the drain. This government has done untold damage to the public's faith in politics. The first step in restoring this trust is publishing these documents today. The public need answers about how this happened, and they need them now, Madam Deputy Speaker. But they also deserve reassurances that this will never, ever be allowed to happen again. Taxpayers' money must be treated with respect, not handed out in backroom deals to cronies or a passport to profiteering. And PPE MedPro is just the tip of the iceberg in this scandal. We now know that companies that got into the VIP lane were 10 times more likely to win a contract. We now know that many did not go through the so-called 8-stage process of due diligence, as ministers have now admitted. And we now know that this left dozens of experienced British businesses out in the cold. Businesses who had the expertise to procure PPE and ventilators precisely and fast. Businesses who offered their help in our darkest hour. And businesses whose only mistake was to play by the rules. Not a single one of the companies referred to the VIP lane was done so by a politician of any other political party other than the Conservative Party. The then Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, the Cabinet member who oversaw the entire emergency procurement programme, reportedly fast-tracked a bid from one of his own personal friends and donors, who went on to win hundreds of millions of pounds of public money. Last week, he said that he simply referred the bid from PPE MedPro on to officials. Yet we also know that he passed it directly on to his ministerial colleague, Lord Agnew. I'll happily give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and she's given a very thoughtful speech that should put everybody on the opposite benches to shame. Was my honourable friend as shocked as I was to find out that there was a company that was put on the VIP lane by mistake, and they still got £1 million contracts?
Gosh. Wow. It is absolute negligence of due diligence when the whole process, which we now know has been tested in the High Court around this VIP access lane, and what that did and what it didn't do. But we know that there is serious concerns from members of the public, and that's what this motion is about today. It's about getting to the bottom of it, and I think the public deserve no less than that. But after the Minister passed it directly on to his ministerial colleague, Lord Agnew, and sometime later, officials discussed that the Minister's office was still being furiously lobbied. The former Health Secretary is also described being lobbied in words I won't quote in the chamber, Madam Deputy Speaker has made it clear, but without any dates or details. So we do not know exactly what conversations or contracts happened behind the scenes. But we do know that £3.5 billion of contracts that have been handed out by this government to their political donors, ministers, mates. And so, yes, we do need an investigation into that too. In fact, we need an investigation into every pound and penny that has been handed out, and to learn the lessons so the public money isn't wasted again. And don't forget, they had previously denied the existence of a VIP lane at all. Well, it existed all right. It allowed Conservative politicians to open doors for anyone with connections to ministers. The WhatsApp Highway Express. And earlier this year, the High Court declared it unlawful. But as my right honourable friend mentioned earlier, it didn't have to be this way. Governments across the world responded to the COVID emergency without wasting billions of pounds of taxpayers' money and relying on dodgy backroom deals. According to the watchdog, the Welsh Labour government managed to prevent health and care bodies running out of PPE. The watchdog said, and I quote, "In contrast to the position described by the National Audit Office in England, we saw no evidence of a priority being given to potential suppliers depending on who referred them." The Welsh Labour government created an open, transparent PPE supply chain, in stark contrast to the approach the Conservatives took in England.
Friend from giving way, she's making a powerful speech. Does she agree with me that
With the benefit of hindsight, this House would not have allowed the government to have the emergency procurement powers that it granted at the beginning of the pandemic if we'd have known how they were going to be used in this corrupt way.
Not used, abused.
I think my honourable friend's absolutely right, and I'd go further in terms of the correspondence that I've been receiving is that the public feel that, and many Conservative voters are absolutely shocked by what they've seen this Conservative government do. They don't believe it speaks to their values, and yet this has happened, and yet we have a procurement bill going forward where this could happen again. So for today at least, the question before the House is simple. Clean up or cover up? I know that members across this House care about our democracy. Although we disagree on many things, I hope we agree on the importance of trust in politics, the values of integrity, professionalism and accountability in public office, the public's wish for more transparency and accountability within these four walls. Put simply, a vote for this motion is a vote in favour of the truth. This government has presided over scandal after scandal that has engulfed their party. They appear to have benefited from dodgy lobbying left, right and centre. And voting today for yet another cover-up will send another very clear message to the public that this Prime Minister cares more about protecting vested interests than putting things right. That his own promise of integrity, professionalism and accountability is just more hot air. After what they've put the British people through, this surely cannot be the message members opposite want to send. Now, Labour has a plan to turn this procurement racket on its head and tackle the obscene waste with an office for value for money to ensure that public money is spent with the respect that it deserves. It's about time members opposite got with that programme. So I say today, and I hope the benches opposite are listening, let's end the cover-up and begin the clean-up and start it now. And I commend this motion to the House.
The question is, as on the order paper. I know that honourable and right honourable members heard what I said previously. I just want to add that whilst these matters are not sub judice, they are under investigation by law enforcement agencies and the Lords Commissioners for Standards, and nothing should be said to prejudice or to prejudge or prejudice any investigations. I'm sure that that will be borne in mind. Minister Wilkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to come to this House to talk about our vital national effort on personal protective equipment. Colleagues must cast their minds back to where we were 3 years ago, as we stood on the precipice of a global health emergency, the likes of which had not been seen for over a century. SARS-CoV-2 was not even called COVID-19 by this point. I will in a moment. And little was known about its impact and transmission. And in a matter of a few short weeks, this novel coronavirus pushed global health systems and global PPE supply chains to near breaking point. Yet here at home, from a standing start, we initiated work on one of the toughest logistical challenges ever undertaken in peacetime, the provision of PPE for frontline colleagues in health and social care.
At the beginning of the pandemic, in one of my first Prime Minister's questions, I asked the then Prime Minister if he would ensure that profiteering would have no place in this government's response to the COVID pandemic. And now fast forward all these years later, and that seems to have been at the very heart. And the question that I have for him is that the British people were told that this government was helping them. British industry was told that they were going to be supported. Well, I have been persisting in my questions about how the domestic diagnostic industry has been promised work by this government, and they are being charged for doing the right thing. Will he apologise to them?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll come on to many of the points that the honourable gentleman raises, but I will just say about UK supply chains. At the beginning of the pandemic, only 1% of PPE used in the UK was produced here. At present, 3/4 of the FFP3 masks provided to the NHS and social care are now manufactured in the United Kingdom, and contracts were signed with around 30 UK-based companies to manufacture around 3.9 billion items of PPE. I will in a moment. Now, Madam Deputy, I'll just make some progress and I will come to colleagues. Now, colleagues will recall those early days. Planes turned around on the tarmac, countries imposing export bans, a huge inflation in global prices, and the price of crucial items like gloves increasing sixfold. Now, these were the conditions under which tough decisions were taken. These were the decisions under which PPE was procured. And these were the conditions, Madam Deputy Speaker, under which we stepped up to protect our most vulnerable and save lives.
Very grateful Minister for giving way. But how does he possibly square the fact that ARCO, a leading clinical PPE supplier to the NHS since its very inception, is existed in Hull for more than 100 years, didn't get a sniff at any contract from the Department of Health because they weren't anywhere near a VIP lane? The Minister should be saying sorry at the dispatch box. Not all this nonsense. Just fess up. Say sorry.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, there were lots of words there and lots of aggression, and I'll come on to address some of the. Well, let's be frank, there was. Let's come on to many of those points, because the honourable gentleman, I fear forgets the pressure under which civil servants were working at the time and the pace at which decisions had to be taken. And if the honourable gentleman would like to write me with those exact conditions.
Order. The honourable gentleman. Order. The honourable gentleman must allow the Minister to answer. It's not fair just to shout back as soon as he starts answering. Minister.
The honourable gentleman will know that civil servants had to take decisions about speed and pace and quantity. They were looking at contracts that would get the most amount of PPE for the best value of money as quickly as possible. I'll take my honourable friend's intervention.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Was everything that was done perfectly? No, and all lessons will be learned, I've no doubt. But he does make, I think, the point which all of us would be well advised to try and remember, because it is now quite a long time ago, the absolute panic and fear. The whole world was trying to buy this stuff at any price that they could get hold of it. And if we neglect that, if we neglect to remember the doctors and the nurses and the care home operators in our constituencies who were knocking on our doors asking for emergency help, then we can't have a proper debate about this issue.
Madam Deputy, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And under those circumstances, in those conditions, we had to be quick and decisive to protect colleagues on the front line so that they could continue providing life-saving care. But with lives on the line, Madam Deputy Speaker, of course, we had to change our approach to procurement and adjust our appetite for risk. And I don't believe, I will in a moment, but I don't believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, as my honourable friend just said, that the British people would have forgiven us if we'd stuck to the same old processes. We had to balance the risk of contracts not performing and supplies being sold at a premium against the real risk, Madam Deputy Speaker, of harm to the health of frontline workers, the NHS and the public if we failed.
Opposition want to have it both ways. They're criticising us for procurement decisions. As I mentioned earlier, they recommended a football agent to supply ventilators, and the same Serco company that they criticise us for having procured PPE from, the Welsh Labour government also procured PPE from.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm keen not to get into a political slanging match on this exact point. But where my honourable friend is right is that all members across this House were receiving multiple emails from people who were, as my honourable friend points out, they were panicking because they wanted to ensure that we were procuring that PPE equipment as quickly as possible. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, colleagues, I will in a moment, colleagues across government and beyond work day and night taking tough decisions to keep our country safe. Those efforts secured billions of items. Now, I'm going to come to civil servants in a moment, and forgive me if I won't give way, Madam Deputy Speaker.
indicated that he will give way in shortly. So I think let him make a bit of progress.
Minister. Interesting comment, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've actually given way equally to both sides so far in this debate. And there is some reluctance, Madam Deputy Speaker, for me to give way to members who tell other members to sit down whilst they are speaking or making interventions. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will later. I said I would and I will. But those efforts of the civil servants secured billions of items, and by June 2020 we'd obtained 30,000 ventilators and delivered more than 17.5 billion items of PPE to protect frontline workers. Now, what does this mean in practice, Madam Deputy Speaker? That we were able to keep our NHS open throughout the pandemic. It meant emergency operations went ahead. And once some of the toughest restrictions were eased, it also meant that relatives could visit their loved ones in and around care homes. I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I just want to take the Minister back to where he mentioned civil servants. According to the government's own records, civil servants were begging ministers not to give contracts to some of these companies because they had red flags, they were overcharging the government almost double the price that they agreed to be paid, which was an extra cost of £50 million to the taxpayers. So civil servants themselves were begging the government not to act in the corrupt manner that they did.
I'm actually very pleased that the Honourable Lady made that intervention, because that's the first I've ever heard such an accusation made. And if the Honourable Lady has evidence of such, I suggest that she presents it. And it might be helpful, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I just talk through the process. Thousands of companies made offers. Around 430 were processed through the high priority lane. Only 12% of those resulted in a contract. Due diligence was carried out on all companies. Due diligence carried out by civil servants. Financial accountability sat with a senior civil servant, and ministers, this is important, Madam Deputy Speaker, ministers were not involved in the decision-making process, and it was a team of over 400 civil servants that processed referrals and undertook due diligence tests. I will come in just one moment. Now, so on that basis, Madam Deputy Speaker, we'll make no apology for procuring PPE at the pace and volume that we did. And now that the global market for PPE has stabilised, I know it's easy for some people to point to the value of goods that are inevitably now sold at a much lower price than we paid. It is a cheap shot, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is one that entirely misses the point. Now, we adjusted down the value of our PPE holding as market prices have changed. That is just standard accounting practice. And even then, we're still putting large quantities of it to use. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, our successes should be judged on the conditions we faced at the height of the pandemic, not with the convenient benefit of hindsight. Now, let me come to civil servants. And if I may give the Right Honourable Lady the benefit of my fast approaching 4 years' experience as a minister. We rely, Madam Deputy Speaker, on hard-working civil servants. They are the backbone of our state, and it is my privilege to work with them. And the Right Honourable Lady, Madam Deputy Speaker, she knows that ministers were not involved in the decision-making process for PPE procurement. And the due diligence, as I've said, was undertaken by a team of over 400 civil servants. Now, although I'm a health minister now, I wasn't at the time, and I remember, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a minister at the Department for Work and Pensions, how hard civil servants worked under the most trying conditions during the pandemic. And those I promise I will come to Honourable Lady. Those 400 civil servants working on PPE and a senior accounting officer took decisions at pace and under huge pressure as lives depended on them. Did they get everything right? No, but they did try their best in a highly competitive global market with significant challenges in sourcing, procuring and distributing PPE. Yes, they absolutely did. And I would just very, very gently say to the Right Honourable Lady that her implied criticism of their professionalism, integrity and independence at a time of crisis now, Madam Deputy Speaker, with the convenience and luxury of hindsight, is deeply regrettable, of course.
I think the Minister is being disingenuous to say that. I've never suggested for one moment that civil servants do not do an excellent job and work diligently in their work. But why won't the Minister publish the documents and the emails about what ministers and what Tory peers and what Tory MPs have been up to during the pandemic and these contracts? Thank you.
I'll come to that. As I said, due diligence was carried out on all companies. Procurement decisions were taken by civil servants. Financial accountability sat with a senior civil servant. So, of course, that is what the Right Honourable Lady is praising. And look, Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank and applaud our hard-working civil servants, and I would humbly suggest, Madam Deputy Speaker, that someone aspiring to be our Deputy Prime Minister should do the same and not seek to throw them under the metaphorical bus.
Thank the Health Minister for giving way. Very early on, the Public Accounts Committee and the National Audit Office was looking into this issue. We know it was a rush at the beginning, but we were warning early on, and the problems persisted. The poor record keeping, frankly, lack of record keeping in many cases. But we gave this House gave the government permission to act fast, but not to act fast and loose. And the Minister just needs to acknowledge that.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her intervention. I'm going to come on a little bit to some of the action that we're going to take. But the Right Honourable Lady rightly mentions accountability, and it's an important point. Details of the high priority lane were published on the 17th of November 2021 and updated in February 2022. And it's an important point, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the Right Honourable Lady, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, suggests that there is some kind of cover-up. Well, if there is, Madam Deputy Speaker, listen to this, because this is some kind of cover-up. So, high priority lane details published on the 17th November and updated in February of this year. The National Audit Office has written 3 reports specifically about PPE. The Public Accounts Committee has held a number of evidence sessions. The Boardman Review has taken place into procurement, and we are implementing their findings in full. The independent public inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic is ongoing. Now, of course, there are lessons that we have to learn and can and should learn, Madam Deputy Speaker, but there is clear accountability in this process. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I mentioned civil servants, I want to put on record my thanks to the 400 civil servants who work tirelessly to source deals from around the globe, buying PPE to the highest standards and quality, and yes, for the best value for the time. But it wasn't only them, Madam Deputy Speaker, it was a true team effort, one that was made possible through some incredible collaborations, including everyone from industry to the NHS, social care providers, to our armed forces. They all played their part, and they played it well. Now, turning, Madam Deputy Speaker, to unsuitable PPE or potential fraud. It is a simple truth, Madam Deputy Speaker, that 97% of all PPE we ordered was suitable and fit for use, with only a small proportion of the billions of items procured deemed unsuitable. Now, where that has been the case, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are actively seeking to recover costs from suppliers, and we're working to maximise the value from our stockpiles, including using PPE in other settings outside of our NHS. Equally, in those rare instances where there have been allegations of fraud, my department's anti-fraud unit has worked quickly to investigate and moved to recover costs. Now, with respect to some of the specific points raised in today's motions, from the thousands of companies that made offers, around 430, as I have said, were processed through the high priority lane, and only 12% of them, Madam Deputy Speaker, resulted in a contract award. Now, the Right Honourable Lady knows that all contracts went through the same due diligence process, regardless of the source of the offer. And she also knows, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the NAO has written 3 reports about PPE, and the Public Accounts Committee has heard a number of hearings. And the Right Honourable Lady would like me to go, I know, into the detail of individual contracts. But she knows, Madam Deputy Speaker, she even alluded to it, that my department is engaged in commercially sensitive mediation with the relevant companies with a view to resolving the issue without recourse to formal legal action. Now, responding specifically to the terms of the motion, the government is committed to releasing information when all investigations are concluded. Our response will necessarily take into account the wider public interest and the commercially sensitive nature of the material. It is only right, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we work with the Public Accounts Committee on the terms on which information might be shared. And I understand the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster will soon begin a dialogue with the Chair of the PAC on how we enact those information sharing arrangements.
I thank the Health Minister for giving way again, and I would just like to reassure him and the House that the Public Accounts Committee is responsible and not reckless. The Public Accounts Committee has previously received papers from this House, and we have a very well-established protocol of receiving and dealing with those papers. And the committee is a trusted committee. We never leak. Well, if we decide to publish, that is a choice that we would make, but it is a responsible decision that we would take.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for that response, and I know the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster will soon begin that dialogue with her. I have given way once before.
The Honourable Lady shouldn't be on her feet when the Minister is answering an intervention from the Right Honourable Lady at the back, because quite simply she's getting in the way of the dialogue. That's not the polite way to do it, right? If her intervention is going to be taken, it will be taken in due course. Standing up for a long time when there's another dialogue going on is really not very polite. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I have given way to the Honourable Lady once already, and I have been generous with my time. And I'm not going to give way one more time. I have given way once before, as I promised I would. I also gave way to the honourable gentleman too. So let's now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we should be proud of the remarkable progress that we have made on PPE. We are now in a position where we are confident we have enough stock to cover all future demands arising from COVID-19. The Right Honourable Lady mentioned some figures in relation to storage costs. I'm pleased to say they are now significantly reduced, and I'll write to the Honourable Lady with those the costs of storing that PPE here in the UK. Moreover, we've strengthened our country's PPE supply chain for the long term, including manufacturing more PPE here in the UK. Before the pandemic, as I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, at the beginning of this speech, just 1% of our PPE was produced here. Now the government has awarded contracts with around 30 manufacturers for the supply of almost 4 billion items of PPE. Now, we have learnt many lessons, Madam Deputy Speaker, from this pandemic. And when it comes to PPE, we are in a stronger footing today than ever before. But the successes of our enormous national effort at a time of unprecedented national crisis deserve to be recognised. People from all walks of life came together to protect people in the NHS and social care, and in doing so, they saved lives. Even as we continue to learn and build a system fit for the future, this government will remain enormously proud of everything that was achieved.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Minister in his robust performance, and he said at the end that the government has learned many lessons, and lesson number one appears to be apologise for nothing. And the Minister knows that no one that I heard was criticising the civil servants. Everyone on this side of the House knows that the civil servants were working in impossible conditions, and conditions that were created by this government. And I understand, and I can see that he's been told to come out swinging and apologise for nothing. Because, let's be honest, from the moment we first learned about the existence of this VIP lane for the politically connected, it was almost inevitable that it would come to this, with members of this House discussing the vast, eye-watering sums of public money that was earmarked for procuring vital protective equipment during the pandemic, but which instead has found its way into the hands of fly-by-night chancellors with little or no knowledge or experience of PPE procurement, but who, and this was probably the most charitable thing I could say about them, who became fabulously wealthy while making an absolute pig's ear of it while trying to learn on the job. And long before PPE MedPro scandal broke, many of us were already trying to work out how did the brains behind this get-rich-quick scheme ever believe that a plan in which the government would fast-track its cronies, their politically connected pals, and now it would appear their parliamentary colleagues, was ever going to end well. And I do suspect, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said during the urgent question on November the 24th, that the absolute shocking allegations that have been levelled against PPE MedPro, both in The Guardian and in The Times, and allegations which lead directly to a member of the other House, may well be the tip of a very, very large iceberg. And I suspect that the reason that the government has been so reluctant to release the papers containing the advice and the correspondence and all the communication between ministers, special advisers relating to the awarding of that contract, is because it didn't want to create a precedent, one which would require them to open the Pandora's box that is the VIP lane for PPE procurement. But the Minister would do well to remember there is another precedent here, because the similarities between today's motion and the motion of the 17th of November last year, when they were instructed to release the papers in relation to the Randox Owen Patterson scandal, are absolutely striking. And they'll recall too how that scandal rumbled on into February, into 2.5 months before the papers were finally made available. But what's also similar to last year's debate, it goes to the heart of today's debate as well, it's the same very simple question. Has this government got something to hide? Is there something this government does not want us to see? Because the Minister must be aware that the more they dodge scrutiny, so the public suspicion will grow that this PPE procurement programme was little more than the get-rich-quick scheme for their politically connected pals. And given what we already know, who can blame the public for thinking that? Because Byline Times recently said that the COVID contract winners were direct result to direct links to the Conservative Party, that's donors and associates, have seen their collective financial position improve by in excess of £300 million. And was anyone really that surprised when Private Eye described, and I quote, how the Department for Health and Social Care's London-controlled PPE cell was dishing out contracts like confetti to opportunistic businessmen? I shall.
What does he think the Scottish public would think about the Scottish Government awarding PPE contracts to, I think, over 20 suppliers without competition, who were brand new, weren't known suppliers to the government before that? What do you think they think about that?
I hate to say it, but my goodness, you're predictable, sir. It was probably the most predictable question I could ever have imagined, and I will come on to it later in my speech. I will come on later to my speech, because the audit of the Scottish Government's treatment of the procurement process compared to what went on in this place is squeaky clean, and I look so forward to having this conversation in about 6 minutes. Because what happened is that many of these opportunists hit the jackpot on the government's VIP lane for PPE procurement, and prominent among them were PPE MedPro, whose bid to supply the UK government with face masks and surgical gowns were put on this high priority lane after what we were told was some particularly enthusiastic lobbying carried out on their behalf by someone down the corridor. Indeed, so enthusiastic was the peer in question about the abilities of PPE MedPro to deliver that she made her passionate pitch to the ministers even before the company was incorporated. And her remarkable powers of persuasion persuaded ministers to propel this embryonic company, one with no experience in delivering medical or protective equipment, and one of which she told them she had no personal involvement and had stood to gain no way financially from, straight into the VIP lane. And on the 20th...
Order. I will just remind the honourable gentleman, he's in danger of straying. I've let him go so far, but I just remind the honourable gentleman, as I remind the House, what the Deputy Speaker said at the beginning of this debate, that the normal rule that reflections must not be cast upon members of either House of Parliament, except on a substantive motion, which this is not, remains in force. So I know the honourable gentleman will be careful in what he says.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I will attempt to stay on the right side of that line, and I'm sure you will instruct me should I stray again. But when this company was propelled into the VIP lane, on the 25th of June 2020, just 44 days after the firm had been legally incorporated, PPE MedPro was handed its first UK government contract worth almost £81 million to supply face masks. Very shortly thereafter, they awarded a second contract worth in excess of £120 million to supply 25 million surgical gowns. Earlier this year, The Guardian reported that they'd seen the contract that was signed between PPE Medpro and the gown manufacturer in China. The price that they paid for those gowns was £46 million. And even adding on a bit for shipping and logistics and storage, by any reasonable calculation, that leaves a whopping profit of somewhere around £70 million of public money on a contract worth £120 million. And to add insult to injury, when the cargo of gowns finally arrived, a quick technical inspection from the National Health Service deemed them not fit for purpose and they were never used. I understand that this situation is so serious that the company is currently under investigation by the National Crime Agency. But inexplicably, up until a couple of hours ago, the peer involved was still operating under the Conservative Party whip. And as the Right Honourable Member for Ashton-under-Lyme said, this stinks. We know it stinks. And the
Order. I'm quite sure that the Honourable Gentleman intends to talk about the process and the goods, etc., and that he will not be mentioning any peer in particular. And he said the peer involved, so it wasn't just peers in general, but a particular peer, and I'm sure that he doesn't want to make reference to any particular peer, but we'll just talk about the process.
I shall, from now on, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you. Because this whole process stinks, and we all know it does. And that's why we have to see what this government knew. This government who deliberately created the conditions in which behaviour like this could flourish. And they have to release what they know. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Could I take him back to his comments earlier about due diligence? Now, we all heard the Minister a few minutes ago claiming that due diligence was carried out in every single case. Is it possible for even the top civil servants in the United Kingdom to do any sort of due diligence on a company that didn't exist 2 or 3 weeks before?
I think it's an excellent question, and perhaps it's a question that had he managed to intervene in the Minister would have been far better placed than I to answer. But I do find it absolutely remarkable how due diligence can be carried out on a company which didn't actually exist. So the government know that the release of the PPE Medpro papers is not going to make this magically disappear. And they're quite right to fear that in releasing those files, they are likely to blow the lid off this Pandora's box, and one which will reveal that its VIP lane for politically connected pals was simply a green light for unfettered crony capitalism, rampant profiteering and widespread abuse of public funds. In his answer to the urgent question on November the 24th, the Minister, the Under-Secretary of Health for Health and Social Care, told this House, and I quote, "There was a global scramble for PPE. It was an extraordinary situation in which we had to act in a different way." And it's a defence that the Minister himself a moment ago also tried to hide behind. And it may be true that things had to be done slightly differently. But what is undeniable is that the UK government made an active choice to act in the way that it did. It was a political choice to make this an all-in free market jamboree. And thankfully, and they did not need to do so. It was a political choice to make this an all-in free market jamboree. And thankfully, and in response to the Honourable Gentleman's chuntering, the Scottish Government acted in an entirely different way. And of course, many items of PPE for Scotland had to be sourced from overseas. But the big difference, and if he would stop talking and listening, I will explain his answer.
No chance.
But the big difference was that our government sent staff from Scottish Enterprise over to China, to source the items we need, ensured they were made to an acceptable standard and were delivered at a cost that we could afford. And at the same time, the Scottish Government was increasingly working with Scottish manufacturers so that by April 2021, 88% of our PPE was being produced in Scotland. And that, I will 2 seconds, and that government involvement had a huge impact on the price. Unit costs showed that disposable face masks cost the NHS in Scotland 31p each, while the Department of Health and Social Care in England paid 40p. That's an increase of 29%.
I'm grateful to Honourable Wren for giving way, and I can personally vouch for what he said about the development of the manufacturing industry in Scotland, because there's an outstanding manufacturer in my constituency that did exactly that. They came in and worked unpaid over the weekend to reset their production lines to make what was needed instead of the high quality stuff they'd been producing before. Does my honourable friend think it is sad that I can't name that company and sing their praises today, because I don't know if they would thank me for connecting them, even tangentially, to some of what the subject of this debate is about? Isn't it sad that even the outstanding, the good Scottish firms are in danger of being tarred with the same brush as has been applied elsewhere?
I think my honourable friend makes an absolutely excellent point, and all of the good that we could and should be talking about is being lost by this tarnished reputation. And he could just as easily have pointed to the Scotch Whisky Association, which pivoted very, very quickly for using its alcohol and turning it into hand gel, and millions of gallons of hand gel. But I go back to the point that government involvement, the Scottish Government's involvement, was absolutely crucial in controlling the price. And I said disposable face masks, 29% cheaper, because they were they were bought by the Scottish Government directly. The FFP3 face mask, Scottish Government, £2.08 a unit. Health and Social Care, £2.51, a fifth higher. Disposable gloves, Scottish NHS, 9p. In England, 33% higher at 12p. Even the cost for non-sterile gloves, the Scottish Government was 10% cheaper. Now, one would have thought that a country with a population 1/12 of the population of England would have a real job in pushing unit costs down below the level of a country 12 times its size. But it goes back to the fact that the approach that the Scottish Government took meant that it was in control of every part of the process, and it secured the deals that it required at a price. Absolutely.
The member is talking about the Scottish Government's track record on procurement and how you bring value to money to the piece. Do you think that's applied across the piece? How well do you think you're doing on when it comes to ferry procurement in Scotland?
They give a ferry contract to somebody with no boats.
It is remarkable. You can always spot when a Tory's sinking beneath the waves when he starts shouting ferries at you. So, and of course, let's remember, this is the government who awarded a ferry contract to a company who no boats.
Is he aware, as perhaps the honourable gentleman from Crewe is not, actually that contract, the Seaborne Ferries contract, cost £13 million. Isn't it not the case that people in glasshouses ought not to throw stones from Crewe?
Well, one would have hoped that people in glasshouses, having thrown the first stone, would have realised that perhaps it wasn't the best idea. But while we're talking about procurement, and let me put on record, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the NHS in Scotland used emergency procurement provisions to award PPE contracts without competition during the first wave of COVID-19. But, and crucially, the auditors are completely satisfied that the procurement arrangements were in place, as saying that there was, and I quote, no evidence of preferential treatment or bias in the awarding of contracts in Scotland.
Was that your hand?
And I believe that that is the significant reason why overall our costs of the pandemic procurement were less than a third of the UK. And it perhaps explains, again, why the government are now paying £770,000 every single day to store PPE in China. And the Minister will be aware, I have tabled a series of questions today to ask how much of that is still usable, how much of it meets the standards required for the UK, and to ask probing questions about the quality control methods were used in securing that. Can you explain that? And the proportion of PPE that did not meet the standard required for the... I will give way if the Minister could tell us exactly the proportion of PPE that was produced that did not meet the standard in the UK.
Quickly update the House. As of October, we hold 13.1 billion items of PPE. We have disposed of 145,000 pallets of excess stock so far. The majority is stored in UK sites. Around 120 million items are still stored in China. The total cost of storage is now below £400,000 a day, so significantly less than the Honourable Gentleman says. And the total cost for storage in China is £35,000 a day.
I genuinely thank the Minister for that information, and I do look forward to rereading it in Hansard until I can actually digest it. But I did think, if I'm correct, that we are now on £500,000 a day in storing PPE. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, having to do things differently doesn't give anyone, whether they're a private individual, an elected politician or an unelected politician, a licence to rip up the rule book and behave as if we live in an unregulated wild west of public procurement. And that is why it is vital that these papers are released, because the public has a right to know why, while doctors and nurses and other medical staff battled unvaccinated through the worst of this pandemic, and as the public stood and cheered them in grateful thanks, why some people with connections to this government saw only the opportunity to make themselves a quick buck. And finally, I do predict that this PPE Medpro scandal is the tip of a very large iceberg, an iceberg that will eventually sink this ship of fools.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to support the motion of PPE. This has become a terrible tale of waste for our country. Firstly, having purchased so much PPE, the taxpayer is now paying to store, and as I've discovered, burn a great deal of it. Secondly, a band of profiteers, some having taken advantage of their political links, exploited our country's desperation. Many of these opportunists, used in chicanery and secrecy, made eye-watering profits. And now the UK Department of Health is withholding information on the cost of staffing its contractual battles with some of these PPE suppliers. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to address the continuing cost of PPE storage. A government response to questions I asked just last month said the department currently holds 13.2 billion items of PPE. The cost of storing this is a staggering £770,000 a day. Now, we've just heard an update to that. I was going to go on to some other date, but that's still going to be, I think, about £128 million a year, Madam Deputy Speaker. If you round that up over the year ahead, that's half the cost of a brand spanking new hospital, and it's a disgrace. Secondly, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've come to hear about the modern-day pirates whose business accounts have been almost impossible to trace and track. Thanks to the Sunday Times, we've heard of a network of companies with connections to Conservative lobbyists. One being Sante Global, formerly Unispace Health. Private Eye deserve a medal for their digging deeper here. Their Profits of Doom special highlighted how Unispace Global Limited won PPE contracts worth nearly £700 million. Richard Brooke is a fantastic journalist there. Reports suggest that they have accounted for their profits through different companies to those known to the Department of Health. So it's impossible to see how much money they've made. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is shrouded in secrecy due to our feeble accountancy laws. Madam Deputy Speaker, the taxpayer deserves to know who is profiting from contracts awarded to the government with public money for the public benefit. It is a high time that this game of PPE treasure hunt came to an end. We need full, open accounting for COVID-19 contracts. These companies should be made to publish full details of their income, their profits, their commissions, their dividends, and their big bosses' bonuses. Then, the Chancellor, I think, should consider a windfall tax on these super profits. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government could also learn a lesson in transparency. In my experience, in recent months, it's trying to dodge questions on the continuing cost of PPE. Last month, I asked the Secretary of State for Health how much unused PPE had been donated, sold, recycled and incinerated since the start of the pandemic. No answer yet. I also asked when he plans to publish the forecast of the cost of resolving these ongoing contractual disputes we've heard a lot about today. Again, no answer yet. Now, there are disputed contracts worth £2.6 billion with 176 companies. That amount could buy us 7 new hospitals. It's important the government pursues this money, so all power to their elbows. However, I think transparency on its processes could really help this cause, because the more we all understand, the better we can hold the bad actors to account. Madam Deputy Speaker, we should support the motion today. As long as the long tail of COVID costs continues, COVID contracts need to be cleared up and the Department of Health must come clean. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Don Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just a few points for the Minister who's no longer in his place. The National Audit Office did not have all the paperwork it needed to give a full and correct report. So therefore, the Minister keeps quoting the National Audit Office saying that due diligence was done on all companies is not correct. And also, the NHS published weekly consumption data during the pandemic. So really the question is, how on earth did we come to buy 5 times more PPE than we actually needed?
Exactly.
It makes no sense. And there's a lot of evidence and paperwork on the Good Law Project website, just for the Minister's reference. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, coronavirus pandemic has been a nightmare for everyone. It was a time of national pain and loss, and for some, it was unspeakable. You know, they lost loved ones, I lost loved ones, and it was also financially damaging for the country. But it is absolutely shocking and unforgivable that some people took the opportunity to see this crisis as an opportunity to seriously line their own pockets, making money out of the misery we all went through. Let's be clear, this money is not free money. This money comes from working people through taxation. And the government's been pickpocketing the working class to fund the lifestyle of the rich. And we still don't know the true extent of the misuse of public money. And that's why this motion is important today. Because even though I and many others have been asking questions for 3 years, what comes back from the government is really quite sparse. And we're having to piece together the information. And that's not good enough for a government. We need to be transparent and honest. And the public deserve to know who was given public funds and how many had links to the Conservatives and what they were paid for. Because I often ask, what were they paid for? What kind of PPE? How many and how many did we receive? And the Minister never comes back with that information. So if the Minister's got the facts and figures for each company broken down, I'd appreciate that the Minister puts that in the diary. And apparently, according to the Minister last week, some companies were paid for PPE even though we had enough PPE in stock. So, and I said, was that deliberate? And he said, yes. And I think that's really quite strange. If we've got enough PPE, you're giving people more PPE, of course. Oh, God.
The Honourable Member claims that we bought 5 times too much PPE. This is not the case. We did have 20% excess capacity against a worst-case scenario, which thankfully didn't materialise. But just to be clear to the Honourable Lady, it is not the case, as she keeps saying, that we bought 5 times too much PPE. It is simply not the case.
Intervention. So can the Minister just clarify, if the NHS was given weekly stats and how much PPE was needed, how comes there's so many much PPE in storage that's costing £750,000 a day to store.
Yeah.
Would the Minister want to come back? Oh, Minister's walked in at the right time.
On that point, it's not the 700,000 figure you just quoted, but just on this point, it is not the case that we bought 5 times too much PPE. She keeps saying this. It's not the case.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I suppose the facts will reveal itself when the Minister shows all of the paperwork and leaves it in the library, and then we can go through the facts and the stats and the figures together. I look forward to that. The thing is that, and we've heard earlier today that they're going through some figures now, Madam Deputy Speaker. I really think that to resolve all of this, to not even have this debate and conversation, just put all the paperwork in the library. We can all go through it together, and that is what's needed, of course.
Giving way. She's making a really powerful speech, as she has done and spoken with incredible experience and heart throughout the last few years on this subject. But does she agree with me that it is particularly galling that we are seeing the former Health Secretary write a book on the pandemic diaries, and yet we are not able to scrutinise the facts and the evidence of the decisions that were taken, not just about the public's money, but also about the public's safety as well?
Absolutely. My honourable friend makes an extremely valid point. And the thing is that I spoke in committee this morning, and I'm not going to read the book, but I think we really do have to scrutinise that book and cross-check the information that the Minister gave in committee to what he's put in his book. Exactly. And I do think that the new ministers that have come into post really should be a little bit more humble, because what has happened is really shocking. The cronyism and the corruption that has happened in the government in plain sight is truly, truly shocking. And now the government is spending £10 million burning PPE. I mean, it's like you're burning the evidence. You wonder why. Madam Deputy Speaker, like COVID hasn't... Oh, so, sorry, the Minister said, I've just criticised the Minister for storing it. Yes, you're right. I wouldn't want the Minister to spend nearly £1 million every day storing PPE. I also don't want the Minister to burn PPE. The Minister should be using the PPE, give it to people who are travelling on the tube. We're having a flu epidemic. You know, it will help resolve that. So don't heckle me when this is your responsibility. So, I mean, this government is totally like in its... Sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker. Anyway, the government is incompetent as well as corrupt, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's not just cronyism. I mean, this situation is so ridiculous. Am I not allowed to call it what it is, Madam Deputy Speaker? It smells like corruption to me.
Order. It's perfectly in order for the honourable lady to say incompetent. But I would be grateful if she would find another form of words rather than saying corrupt.
Suspicious, innit? But, I mean, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is so ridiculous that when the Netflix series comes out, nobody's going to believe this is a true story. I mean, recently it was revealed, and I know we're not supposed to speak about the Conservative peer too much, but we do learn today that they're taking a leave of absence from the Lords. And I mean, I do hope, and I'm not saying this in jest, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I do hope that she's not on her yacht trying to do a runner, because there's a lot of money that's gone missing, and by the previous minister's own words, he was being bullied into giving this contract. I know, I don't feel sorry for him, but he was being bullied, and 2 ministers were being bullied. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important that we investigate this VIP lane. The National Audit said companies, as I said earlier, companies were put there by mistake and they were still given millions of pounds. That surely shows you that due diligence wasn't done because the company was there by mistake. How did they get all that money? And when the minister gets to his fee. I wonder if he could tell the House how many of these companies existed before the pandemic. If the Minister can't, then of course we look forward to that information in the library or when this motion passes today, which I hope it does. And for the avoidance of any doubt, we all know that the PPE, the VIP lane was a bit dodgy. That is just a fact and it's on record. But this has all come to light, not because Parliament has managed to force the government to reveal everything that's happened. It's come to light because a bank reported unusual activity and have dropped a certain person and her husband in fear of reputational damage. That is what's brought this particular scandal to light. And the National Crime Agency is now investigated. And the thing is this, the Serious Fraud Office is also investigating contracts, and as other people have said, this is just the tip of a very, very large iceberg. And the Serious Fraud Office is also investigating contracts won by another company, Pharmaceuticals Direct Limited, which paid a whopping £20 million fee to a middleman. Sergit Sergil, who worked for Samir Jassal, and together they had a hotline to Boris Johnson's special advisor, Munira Mirza, and we also know, because we've seen the emails, that they were helped by Matt Hancock and Priti Patel. £20 million for a middleman. So the question is, why does a company, if it's going to go through due diligence and believes that it's participating in a proper process, why would they agree to pay somebody £20 million to a politically connected middleman? That doesn't make any sense, does it? Because if everybody's treated the same, you don't need to pay somebody £20 million to move you up the list. It's, you know, as I said, we can't say the word corruption. I'm trying to think of other words. Hopefully more will come to me and I will use those. But I feel that it feels very much like a cash for COVID contract. And it's a mystery what's happened to that money. 18 months after the case was referred, the Serious Fraud Office has still continued to investigate it. There are so many more, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I can speak about. There is a thread on my Twitter, if anybody's interested, that talks about some of the other companies where there are huge questions to be answered. But the government needs to open up its books. The government needs to ensure that there is proper scrutiny. Because, yes, of course, we accept mistakes were made, and some of them were unavoidable. But the Health Department didn't do the fraud checks that it was supposed to do, and we had to push them, and it didn't come out to a whole year later. There's been negligence, but there's been something a little bit more sinister happening in government. And there's people who have stolen money from the public purse during a national crisis. Those people should be ashamed. It's not patriotic. Don't say I was doing it for the country. You're not doing it for the country when you're pocketing millions of pounds. It's not patriotic, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a word that you're not happy with me using. They will have had the people who have taken this money unlawfully, really, but really it was helped by government ministers. But the people who have taken this money have had plenty of interest payments from their ill-gotten gains. But now is the time, during the cost of living crisis, to give that money back. And that includes, Madam Deputy Speaker, the donations that have been given from these people that have had a bung from this COVID crisis. The donations to the Tory party need to come back into the public purse. Thank you.
I'll have to put a time limit on now of 4 minutes. Naz Shah.
Mr. Speaker. As an opposition, we expect to scrutinise government, to hold them to account and challenge them on policy and legislature, but never did I imagine scandals, favours and dodgy deals through VIP lanes. The contract we're focusing on today is about the 200 million deal to provide PPE to the government at the height of the first COVID-19 lockdown, allegedly awarded to a company linked to and lobbied by a Tory peer, who also happened to benefit around the tune of £29 million transferred to an offshore account which is linked to her and her adult children.
Disgraceful.
The seriousness of this case is such that earlier this year the police raided 2 London properties linked to the Tory peer, as well as 4 properties on the Isle of Man, in support of an ongoing fraud investigation by the National Crime Agency. We're literally speaking about a criminal fraud investigation where the trail leads directly back to the centre of government. Consistently, the government line has been that they were doing their best to ensure the best quality of PPE could be secured and used during the COVID-19 pandemic. The truth is the government was ripping off the British taxpayer to help the pockets of their friends. In May 2020, Baroness Mone referred PPE MedPro to the Cabinet Office for potential multi-million pounds PPE contract, 5 days before it was even registered as a company. What track record can a company that doesn't even exist have to deliver millions of pounds of PPE for the government? In significant contrast is Multibrands, like many other businesses across the country. Multibrands International Limited, a Bradford-based business in my constituency, incorporated in 1998, which provided PPE and had an operation in China since 2006, a support office in India since 2010, a legitimate and established company was denied the opportunity to provide government PPE. At the time, Multibrands International wrote to me and asked the question, what does our government do for businesses like us? Is it because we are northern? Is it because we choose to operate legitimately? Or is it because we don't have secret dealings with MPs? We were never given a chance. And shamefully, that there is the truth. They were never given a chance. Because unlike the then Health Secretary's local mate from the pub, they didn't have his WhatsApp number or any of a Tory minister's private numbers or direct access email to a Tory minister. Instead, rip-off contracts were given to their Tory friends to profit from the British taxpayer. In my neck of the woods, the idea of mates rates is when you generally get a better deal, and usually it goes something like this. Well, I'd normally charge a £5, but because it's you and you're my mate, I'll knock you off a few pennies. Exactly. In this case, according to documents leaked to the Times, it shows that during the pandemic, PPE MedPro supplied masks at a cost of 38.5p each to the government. The same masks, not later downvalued, at the same time, same company, were provided to other suppliers for as little as 14.5p. Wow. No one rips off their friends, but it was okay for the Tories and their cronies to rip off a British taxpayer. 8.7 billion was written off, including 4 billion that was spent on PPE, which did not meet NHS standards. National Audit Office revealed the DOH paid 436 million in penalties because it had to store PPE. That's more than a year's budget for my whole local council in Bradford of 2021-2022. Wow. And I could have, with 8.7 billion that's written off, we could have had those 3 hospitals, whilst the health minister's here, in Bradford, including the first carbon neutral one, including a state-of-the-art one in Bradford City Centre, replacing 2 in my constituency. The British people will not forgive them for ripping off whilst they suffer through winter where they choose between eating and heating. So publish your documents, come clean, and ultimately, as in the words of the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party when she opened up this debate, stop the cover-up and start the clean-up.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this government's actions on PPE were a catalogue of failures from start to finish and with devastating consequences. Before coronavirus, the existing PPE stockpile didn't include everything it should have. Then the government was slow off the mark. It took too long to understand that we would need more PPE and failed to get on with ordering it. This meant that in the first wave of the pandemic, those on the front line were left dangerously exposed. I know, because when I returned to care work to help relieve the strain on my former colleagues, I saw firsthand masks being rationed and visors donated by the public. When I spoke out about these PPE shortages, members on the opposite benches insinuated that I was lying. Among them, and I've informed the members that I will be referencing them, were the Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Mid-Bedfordshire, a Health Minister at the time, and the Honourable Member for Mansfield. Now, despite report after report proving that there were PPE shortages and that I was telling the truth, not one has ever apologised for these comments. It's not me I want them to apologise to, but the millions in the care sector, both staff and people they were caring for, who were forgotten and neglected by their government. The government put care workers' lives at risk, as well as people receiving care, while those workers, overwhelmingly women and disproportionately migrants, earn poverty wages. But of course that wasn't everybody's experience of the pandemic. while my former colleagues worked day and night for a pittance, and with some carers paying with their lives, the rich saw the chance to cash in. One businessman's company made a £70 million profit on a contract for PPE that was reportedly not suitable for the NHS and therefore went unused. He paid himself £13 million and celebrated his birthday last week by eating a cake shaped like a briefcase of cash on a private yacht. Mellors Designs was awarded PPE contracts worth more than £170 million. In 2020, it made profits of over £13 million. That's a 9,000% increase on the previous year. And one of the co-owners had donated nearly £60,000 to Conservative politicians and the Central Party since 2009. Unsurprisingly, the company was referred to the fast-track VIP lane by a Conservative minister. Once the government started ordering PPE, Madam Deputy Speaker, all too often it wasn't about who could supply the best, the fastest, at a reasonable price. It was about who had connections to the party opposite. Those referred to the VIP lane were 10 times more likely to be awarded contracts. So the government acted unlawfully, wasted billions of pounds in taxpayers' money in the process, and failed to protect those on the front line. Madam Deputy Speaker, we talk about how corruption robs citizens and ruins public services in countries across the world, but when it's happening right here in front of our very eyes, we dress it up in euphemisms. So I urge the government to come clean and release all the papers relating to the awarding of contracts, yes to MedPro, but also to all contracts awarded through the VIP lane.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise today to support this motion, but the sentiment I feel most strongly is what a mess. What an unnecessary, unmitigated mess. We've heard a lot from the benches opposite about how difficult it was at the time. We all know how difficult it was at the time. We all experienced it. We've heard a lot about having to be quick and decisive, the pressure that people were working under, their lives were at stake. I wonder if the Minister appreciates that's exactly why people are so angry at this. Because we all went through it and we all experienced it. And the thing that we remarked upon most, I think, at that time was the spirit in the country. Yeah. And how everybody got behind the government, even those of us whose job it is to scrutinise the government. We got behind the government, people had faith in the government, believed in the government, supported them. And now 3 years down the line, we're waking up every morning to yet another news story. Another scandal, more suggestions about what might have gone wrong. And people feel let down. They feel betrayed. The numbers are frightening. £2 billion at one point of taxpayers' money wasted on contracts for PPE. Now it's almost 10 billion, we're told, was wasted on PPE in total. We're hearing about PPE being stored, being burned. That's not really the issue for the people in my constituency and elsewhere in the country who are struggling this winter to make ends meet, who've got massive energy bills, who wonder if they're going to be able to feed their children, who are worried about what their mortgages are going to cost. What is bothering them is that when they were putting their faith in the government, when they believed in the government that we were all in this together, that maybe we weren't. The suggestion now that some people were profiting from other people's pain. And that is why, in supporting this motion, I would put a plea to the government to listen to what we're saying. What we're saying is not, civil servants were wrong, that the government was, wrong. What we're saying is people need to know what actually went on. They need some transparency. When the Prime Minister, the latest Prime Minister, became Prime Minister, he promised us a government that would be ethical, would have at its heart doing the right thing. Well, we need him to be good as that word now. We need him to make it clear that he will leave no stone unturned, that his government will leave no possibility of anything sleazy, of any cronyism, of anyone having profited at the cost and the expense of the British public at a time of extreme, because it was extreme, national crisis. That is why this debate today is important. That is what we need from the government now. We need something of that spirit that we had back then, when things looked so dark, we were all worried for ourselves, for our families, for our health, for our futures. We need something of that spirit now, and for the government to stick by what the Prime Minister has said and to give us the transparency. Let us see the papers. Put everything out in the open. And please, ban VIP lanes, because the very notion that there was such a thing as a VIP lane when the country was in the midst of a pandemic and people were dying is offensive. Thank you.
Kate Holler. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, members across this House made repeated warnings about contracts being awarded to companies during the toughest days of the pandemic, especially those in the high priority lane. But Madam Deputy Speaker, it wasn't just about PPE. I raised concerns about testing kits that put residents in care homes in Blackburn at risk. Today, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's about a failure of proper due diligence. This was not a harmless failure. There were failures that hampered our responses to COVID and enriched VIP politicians while putting public at risk. Constituents were eager to help. Companies were eager to help. The support that was offered was tremendous. Support to provide equipment, support that could have saved lives had it been accepted much, much sooner. I'd like to read a section of an email from a constituent who's the Managing Director of a medical equipment company in Blackburn. They've been going 30 years. They provide equipment right across the world. This company in March contacted the government to offer their services. 6 weeks later, no response. Wow. 6 weeks lost. The response, when it did come, was pretty miserable. Gosh. It pointed them to a link on the government's website. They still never got any response. Okay. But the paragraph I want to quote is what the Managing Director says. None of what I am seeing makes any sense. When all this calms down, as one day it will, the lawyers will have a field day. People are using non-medically approved or tested equipment, whilst there are recognised businesses that can supply the necessary approved and tested PPE that have been ignored by the government. Yep. This is a company that was producing PPE for councils and other public bodies who had been let down by the government. This scandal has been exposed, and it is important that cronyism is never allowed to happen again. Billions of pounds of public money wasted, lives lost, and it's disappointing so few members opposite are here to listen to the failures, because you can only learn by your mistakes, and they're turning a deaf ear to this scandal. Accountability, openness, honesty, integrity are all on the table this evening, and it'd be shameful if members opposite failed to vote. This is a call for transparency, and we must not fail the public in these situations ever again. We must demonstrate we've learned from mistakes. We must demonstrate transparency. And if, as the Minister claims, there's nothing to see here, it's all been done properly, I would suggest he votes for this motion and makes a promise to put the papers in the library as soon as possible. No good there.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I will certainly be supporting the motion today. I commend the opposition for devoting part of the day to it. It's perhaps unfortunate that they didn't realise that there's another very, very interesting piece of contract lobbying that was carried out, where apparently the contract was not awarded to the person who did the lobbying, who was later described by a senior civil servant as being incandescent with rage that her chosen supplier hadn't been successful in that case. I don't know whether it was the same company we're talking about today or a different one, but it's quite clear that there has been more than one instance of lobbying in order to get very lucrative contracts to companies that are well connected. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Minister, when he spoke, referred several times to the fact that the National Audit Office have looked at this and the Public Accounts Committee have looked at it. Well, that's okay. Everything must be fine. I wonder why the Minister didn't choose to enlighten those members who haven't read those reports, some of the things that are in those reports. National Audit Office, 26th of November 2020. Some procurements were carried out before all key controls were put in place. The Department had awarded contracts to 71 suppliers, total value £1.5 billion, before the financial and due diligence process was standardised. National Audit Office again, in reference to the claim that 97–98% of all items were usable. The Department estimate that 3.6 billion items, 11% of the total, with a value of £2.9 billion, are not currently suitable for frontline service. In other words, when we talk about 97% of them being usable, it means we might have paid for high-grade clinical sterile equipment that can be used as a face mask if you're cutting up wood to keep the dust out of your lungs. That is not frontline clinical use. The Public Accounts Committee, this is in July this year, the Department still, 2 years after the contracts were signed, still lacks a stock management system that enables it to fully understand what PPE it's got and where it is. They don't know what they've got, they don't know where it is. Public Accounts Committee again, there was insufficient due diligence checks at the outset of the pandemic to prevent potential profiteering and to identify conflicts of interest. Exactly the concerns that members of this House were raising from day one, being confirmed now by the Public Accounts Committee. And finally, a conclusion from the Public Accounts Committee, we are unsurprised to see the reports of excessive profits and conflicts of interest on PPE contracts. We can only speculate as to why the Minister didn't find time to refer to any of the actual content of those reports when he was addressing us earlier on. The Minister, as I said, boasted that 97–98% of items were usable. Notice he said items. He didn't talk about the value of those items. Because if you buy clinical, or if you order clinical gloves, and you get gloves that aren't suitable for clinical use, you can still use them to keep the oil off your hands if you're servicing your car. But each of those is pennies each. As we've already heard, there was millions of pounds worth of sterile gowns that can't be used because they weren't sterile. Why is it that the Minister chose to give us part of the truth but not the whole truth? Failings by the Government have meant that there is at best a huge question mark over this whole process. It means that the legitimate firms and the very hard-working professional civil servants are left with a question mark over them. And it's quite clear that in some cases, a minority of cases, but some significant cases, those question marks are not question marks at all, they are exclamation marks. It's quite clear that things have happened that should not have been allowed to happen, that require further investigation. The Government may have its reasons for wanting to keep this information, not necessarily from the public, but from the Public Accounts Committee. That information has got to be released, and it has to be left to the judgment of the impartial Public Accounts Committee to decide what is made public and what is kept secret.
Well, my honourable friends have laid out very clearly the shocking scandal that this PPE contract is. And people have also mentioned people working hard at the front line, putting themselves in danger to help others, and of course all those who lost their loved ones. What I would like to concentrate on is the damage that the VIP lanes have done to loyal, reputable companies, the backbone of British business, who were offering to be generous, to go the extra mile to help, rather than looking for chances to rip the taxpayer off. BCB International is a company which operates in my constituency and in Cardiff, and a long-established company, manufacture and supply of life-saving equipment, including medical equipment, and their primary customers in the UK are the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Justice, and many police forces, and they export approximately 40% of their turnover. The sort of things they make include a very good fuel for camping gas stoves called Fire Dragon. And the point is, they were registered, they were known to the MOD, they were known to the MOJ, they were a company which had a good reputation and were ready to go. In March 2020, they were in production of their high-quality hand sanitizer, Dr. Brown's, in Llanelli. They employed up to 100 staff and worked 24/7. Their 80% sanitizer passed all the appropriate tests, and Dr. Brown's is well liked and used by the NHS in Wales, as well as a number of police forces and other public bodies. Now, due to the PPE shortages, the UK government committed early on in the pandemic to back British business. And the government's UK Make programme, headed up by Lord Dayton, was tasked to unleash the potential of UK industry to scale up domestic PPE manufacturing. As Lord Dayton said in May 2020, as countries around the world face unprecedented demand for PPE, British industry is stepping forward to make sure vital pieces of equipment reach our workers on the front line. My role is to increase our homegrown PPE supplies, both now and in the future, by investing in the potential of UK manufacturing. But I understand that the UK Make policy was subsequently withdrawn in September 2020. Now, in May 2020, following the government initiatives, BCB invested $700,000 in new sanitizer production equipment. They also bought in high-quality FFP3 face masks from Europe, set up gown production and made oxygen bottle bags. And they supplied all of these successfully and on time to the Welsh NHS and Welsh and English police forces and the MOD. And from March 2020, the company had regularly tried to sell their British PPE products to the Department of Health and Social Care. And they provided a brief overview of just some of the names that they were in contact with, which I haven't time to read out now. But they tell me that they made these contacts and many, many other emails, but they have never, ever, ever been contacted back. And this is an absolute, utter disgrace. And I think today we have seen why that was the case. And there was no need for it to be the case. For loyal, good companies who did absolutely everything they possibly could, turned their workforce to working for the country, were completely ignored. And as has been mentioned, it was not like this in Wales. And they spoke very, very highly of the Welsh procurement procedure. And it's no wonder then that the Auditor General in Wales said, in contrast to the position described by the NEO in England, we saw no evidence of a priority being given to potential suppliers depending on who referred them. Those are extremely strong words from an auditor, depending on who referred them, referring to what was happening in England. And the Welsh Government did put in place good arrangements overall. That is such a contrast, and that is what is so damaging to all the good businesses in this country who want to play by the rules. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Shadow Minister Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to be able to close today's debate on behalf of His Majesty's opposition. And I share the indignation of my honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, that we are once again having to come here to table a humble address to force the government to come clean with the British public. It's all about transparency. There are questions that need to be answered. The members opposite can either support today's binding vote to force ministers to come clean or be complicit in the continuing cover-up. The choice is theirs, and their constituents are watching. The VIP lane is a national scandal that will cast a long shadow for years to come. It does take us back to the dark days of 2020 when COVID was spreading, when people were dying and there wasn't enough PPE for those frontline workers. Schools donated goggles, volunteers sewed gowns in their homes, nurses and care home workers had to resort to wearing bin bags. The members today from Glenelg Gwent, Brent Central, Bradford West, Nottingham East and Llanelli have very well articulated the anger that is felt by our constituents across the country that they want to have questions answered. This shift to procurement was necessary. No one's denying that. We had to have fast procurement. That didn't lead to all procurement procedures being jettisoned along the way. This whole failure to provide usable PPE, huge contracts to shell companies, industrial scale waste, Madam Deputy Speaker, of taxpayers' money, and then an industrial scale cover-up. £12.6 billion was spent in total on PPE, but £8 billion of this was written off. £4 billion of this was not up to standard, was unusable. £3.6 billion worth of contracts raised one or more red flags for possible corruption, according to Transparency International. 176 contracts are now in legal dispute, worth £2.6 billion. And the consequences continue, as we've heard from the members today. Up to a few weeks ago, £770,000 was being spent every day. I had to check this several times. Really, every day. It couldn't be right. £770,000 was being spent every day to store the faulty PPE here and in China. That was over £5 million a week, £280 million a year. That's enough to pay free school meals of all primary school children in Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool and Nottingham put together, Madam Deputy Speaker, or 8,000 nurses a year. I've heard the clarification from the Minister that that amount has reduced, and that's very welcome, but it's still £400,000 a day. 120 million PPE items are being stored in China. What is going on? I speak today for the millions who are sat in freezing homes, relying on food banks during this cost of living crisis, and hearing that Britain is being ripped off by the Tories. The Chair of Council at the British Medical Association said the deadly mismanagement around the supply of PPE is one of the greatest failings of this government's handling of the pandemic. There must be a reckoning, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government was in power for a decade when COVID began, but it didn't have good enough emergency plans in place, and that's why they didn't have enough stockpiles of PPE. That's why they had to panic buy. They bypassed existing, scaled-up British-based providers of PPE. They chose shell companies that had no experience. They gave huge contracts and jettisoned those good contracting procedures. Other countries managed to do it at the same time. We should have been able to do it too. Fair enough to move to emergency contracting, to streamline contracting, to speed it up, but no checks on companies, Madam Deputy Speaker, no checks to see if the masks met NHS standards. Did no minister intervene and say, look, this isn't right. Emergency procurement procedures don't mean no procurement procedures. Did no minister say, assure me these companies can deliver, this is taxpayer money? Did no minister say, ensure me that the VIP lane is not being used for mates, for donors, for pub landlords, to get these contracts over actual PPE contracts? Did no minister say, assure me that the contract ensures that if the PPE is faulty, the taxpayer will not pay? No, it seems not. What happened was wrong, and it's disappointing that ministers are keeping on defending it. If ministers don't own this, admit it was wrong, they won't make the changes, and it could well happen again. I think that's what everyone in the country knows is true, that the first instincts of the Conservative Party, if there was another pandemic tomorrow or another emergency, will not be to go to correct procurement procedures and make sure that our taxpayers' money is not spent wrongly. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to tell you about two types of company. The first is ARCO, and we've heard of others from members. ARCO is a Hull-based market leader in PPE production. They have 135 years of experience and work with 110,000 customers, and they hold key framework agreements, including with NHS supply chain. They are very experienced in provision of expert advice and appropriate and compliant PPE during epidemics, including foot and mouth, mad cow disease, swine flu, Ebola. They have their own accredited product assurance lab, 400,000 square foot national distribution centre and a sourcing team based in China. All of that, it was in place at the beginning of COVID. They had PPE of the standard required manufactured, ready to go. They contacted the government, and what was the reply, Madam Deputy Speaker? They were ignored. Their offers went unanswered. When PPE MedPro wasn't even a company until May 2020. They were awarded a contract for £122 million for provision of 25 million gowns and another one of £81 million for face masks. Pestfix was a pest control company with net assets of £18,000 in 2019. The director, Joe England, met the Department for Health and Social Care's Chief Commercial Officer, Steve Oldfield, at the 80th birthday party of Mr Oldfield's father-in-law. They were referred to the high priority lane, went on to win nearly £350 million of contracts, but were fined £70 million for delivery of faulty masks and gowns. There was the mobile phone case designer that recorded £1 million loss in 2019. They were referred to the high priority lane by a former Conservative Party chairman. They received a £13 million contract to provide PPE. Mela Designs was a fashion accessories company that was referred by the Honourable Member for Surrey Heath. David Miller was a donor to his leadership campaign in 2016. The company received contracts of £170 million. Ienda Capital was a family investment firm specialising in currency trading, offshore property and private equity. An obvious go-to for supplying PPE. They were referred by Andrew Mills, an unpaid advisor to the Board of Trade, which is chaired by the Honourable Member for South West Norfolk, and I have advised her of mentioning her. The problem is that they provided £40 million of unusable face masks, yet still posted a £25 million gross profit in 2020. And the list goes on. What do we need instead, Madam Deputy Speaker? We need a national resilience strategy. Yep. We need a procurement bill that's not full of loopholes. Yep. We need a whole system approach, not a mad panic and pick your mates to make money approach currently accepted. That's why this matters, Madam Deputy Speaker. That's why we're asking to see the documents. I hope the whole House will support this motion and ensure the government gets the most basic responsibility of government right. Yep. That is to keep us safe.
Minister Neil O'Brien.
Deputy Speaker, now to make sure that I get to them, I want to respond to some of the very important points made by backbench members at the very top of my remarks. Now, the member for Hull East, who's sadly not in his place at the moment, mentioned ARCO not getting a contract. But my understanding is that they did get a contract. So we should resolve what is correct. My understanding is they actually did get a contract. Argyll and the Honourable Member for Argyll and Mute mentioned the two different contracts for Medinborough, and it's very important to be clear. One of those contracts did deliver, PPE was delivered, that's fine. One didn't, and that's the one that we're taking enforcement action on, because of course, we are, like all these contracts, we are just as keen as everybody else to make sure that we get taxpayers' money, that we get good value for money for taxpayers, and we enforce whenever things haven't been delivered. The Honourable Member for Bradford West, the Honourable Member for Blaenau Gwent first, called for the publication of companies that were in the high priority group and then got contracts, something which happened in November 2021. The Honourable Member for Bradford West, I do slightly disagree with one point that she made, which is that the argument that we shouldn't have had any contracts with firms that hadn't previously been PPE, just one moment, that she argued that we shouldn't have any contracts with firms that hadn't previously been PPE suppliers, and of course lots of new firms were coming into the market, and part of our drive to get more UK supply relied on that very point. I'm just going to complete my tour of people's contributions so far. The Honourable Member for Brent Central said that we should donate and reuse PPE, and I'm pleased to tell her that that is precisely what we are doing. The Honourable Member for Edinburgh West said that we're in the middle of a major cost of living issue, and she's absolutely correct. That's why we're spending £55 billion on energy support. That's why we have the £900 payment for 8 million poorer households. That's why we're raising the national living wage to a record level, which is worth about £1,600 for a full-term worker. Now, the members for Blackburn and Llanelli, I will do, but I'm trying to respond to everyone's points first. So if you can hold on, we will get there. The Honourable Members for Blackburn and Llanelli both made the point that we wanted to get more UK producers making PPE. My honourable friends already made the point that we've gone from 1% of FPP3 masks being made in the UK to 75%. I'd also mention our work with Moderna to get more development and production of vaccines happening in the UK as part of that exciting deal. The member for Glenrothes said that one of the potential suppliers had been incandescent with rage because they didn't get a contract. Now, that is the system working. Contracts were being turned down. 90% of those who went through the... Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm desperately trying to respond to all the...
Order. Give the Minister a chance to respond to all the questions. I've tried to give enough time for that. Minister, Now let him get on with it.
So I'm keen to reply to them. He talked about only 3%, and I'm literally responding to the honourable gentleman. He talked about this point about only 3% not being reusable, and implied that some of the other things, they were only fit for servicing your car. Now, to be clear about that, some of these things have a different clinical use. So, for example, the NHS tends to use and wants to use aprons on a roll when you have the choice, once you have a normal PPE market, and what we do therefore is use the flat pack ones that we had and donate them to care homes. Also, self-assembly visors, not preferred in the NHS because they take a bit of time to assemble, hence giving them to dentists and the like. And there have been two different mentions of uses of the word writing off in this debate, and it's very important to be clear about the difference between these two things. Some people talk about writing off for things that are not usable, and that is the 3%. Only 3% of what was purchased is in that category. And then there is a different accounting use of the words writing off, which is something you have to do. We bought, let's be clear, we bought a load of PPE because we needed it in the middle of the pandemic. It was more expensive during that time. It was worth more than that it is now, and that is the accounting meaning. But let's be clear about the two different uses of writing off. There are so many questions. I'm not quite sure which interventions to give way to, but I think I should start at the back.
Nick Smith.
Can I thank the Minister for giving way, but just to say he attributed comments to me which I did not make, and I just want to put that on the record. But I do have a question for him. Does the Minister accept that there has been excessive profits made on the back of some of these PPE contracts?
I'm about to go through the due process that we went through and the incredibly forensic work that our civil servants did. And just to be clear, again, for the benefit of the House, ministers did not make decisions on contracts. Officials, as usual, made the decisions on contracts. And I'll talk more about the process that we went through in the very short time that we have remaining. So we've seen, during the dark days of the pandemic, a collective approach that saw hundreds of millions of life-saving vaccine doses delivered, the largest testing infrastructure in Europe established from a standing start, and the distribution of tens of millions of items of PPE. A uniquely complex challenge even in normal times, but a particular challenge when the entire world was trying to get these goods. One of my members opposite don't want to have the courtesy to listen to the answers to the questions that they have asked. A strange approach. So we delivered 20 billion items to the front line and to our broader workforce. So we're still, in fact, delivering 5 million items a month. That was enough to deliver even the response to a worst-case scenario, which fortunately didn't emerge, and that's why we have that 20% excess stock that I mentioned before. It is simply not the case, as one honourable member mentioned, that we had 5 times too much PPE. Simply not the case. But let's remember the context, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was the former leader of the opposition, the member for Islington North, who said it was a matter of safety and patient safety, and we agreed, that's why we acted. Is the Shadow Health Secretary at the time who said our NHS and social care staff deserve the very best protective clothing and they urgently need it. And we agreed. And it was the current Shadow Chancellor who called for a national effort which leaves no stone unturned, and that is exactly what we did. And that is
Stop shouting, Minister.
Say that. She don't want to repeat it? No, she doesn't want to repeat it, clearly. Let me be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker. At every point in the procurement process, the process is rightly run by our brilliant commercial professionals. Ministers aren't involved in the procurement process. Ministers aren't involved in the value of contracts. Ministers aren't involved in the scope of contracts. And ministers aren't involved in the length of contracts, something echoed by the National Audit Office, whose report concluded that the ministers had properly declared their interests and that, I quote, there was no evidence of their involvement in procurement decisions or contract management. The role of ministers was exactly what you would expect. Approaches from suppliers were passed on to civil servants for an independent assessment. And to look at the scale of the effort again, Madam Deputy Speaker, 19,000 companies made offers, around 430 were processed through the high priority group, only 12% of those resulted in a contract for 51 firms. And that group was primarily about managing the many requests that were coming into ministers from people right across this House, from people across the country who are desperate to help with that national challenge of getting more PPE. And there had to be a way of dealing with them. But to be clear, due diligence was carried out on every single company. Financial accountability sat with a senior civil servant. All procurement decisions were taken by civil servants. And a team of over 400 civil servants processed referrals and undertook due diligence checks. A huge operation run by the civil service, and I thank them for their work in getting our NHS the PPE that it needed. Let me be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm not going to stand here and say there weren't any lessons to be learned. Of course there are. But we should be clear about what the lessons are. And despite the global race to get PPE, only 3% of the material source couldn't be used as fit for purpose. But we have built more resilient supply chains. We're implementing the recommendations of the Boardman Review of Pandemic Preparedness in full. I've mentioned the growth of UK procurement of face masks and of vaccines. But in closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to thank all of those who've been involved in this important conversation. We should be rightly proud of what was achieved during those dark and difficult days at the start of the pandemic, operating in conditions of considerable uncertainty. We were in a situation, Madam Deputy Speaker, where literally there was gazumping going on. If you didn't turn up with the cash, things were removed that you had bought from the warehouses. That was the global race that we were in to source these things. And I think that the team, the 400-strong team of civil servants who led this process, did a remarkable job from a standing start of sourcing the goods we needed. There have been, I think, during this debate, we've heard a number of deliberate obfuscations, I think, of the different things that ministers and officials do. To be clear, all of these decisions went through an 8-stage forensic process, which was run entirely by officials, and it did not get you a contract to go into this high priority group. That was simply about managing the sheer number of bids for contracts that were coming in to people across this House. And at the time, although memories are very short and the barracking has continued...
The question is that the question being output, as many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is, as on the order paper, as many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. I think the ayes have it. It's inadvisable for people to shout other things if I'm listening for the ayes having it. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And so that concludes the debate. And we move now to motion number 3 on exiting the European Union, animals. Motion number 4 on animals. Motion number 5 on financial services. Minister to move. The question is, as on the order paper. Does that opinion say aye? Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We can't continue making all this noise when I'm on my feet. No? Thank you. We now come to motion number 6 relating to the Committee of Public Accounts. Sir Bill Wigan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move.
Is as on the order papers. Does that opinion say aye? Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And motion number 7 relating to the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Sir Bill Wigan.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as well as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Petition. Scott Benton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to present this petition on access to NHS dental care in Blackpool to the House. This petition has been signed by over 790 residents, but is also on behalf of the thousands of my constituents who are currently without an NHS dentist. It is clear that urgent reform of the current dental contract is required in order to incentivise dentists to practice in areas such as Blackpool. The petitioners therefore request that the House of Commons urge the government to act quickly to improve access to NHS dental care in Blackpool.
Scott Benton. I can't stand this in here.
I hope I didn't fall too far.
Petition. Access to NHS dental care in Blackpool.
I beg to move this House to now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Peter Grant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I hope it's in order before I begin for to place on record my hearty congratulations to my honourable friend from Aberdeen South